Okay, so for today's set of notes, which is 7.11, we are going to be starting with the battles and the military side of World War II. So for those of you guys who've been waiting all year for battles and military stuff, this is finally going to be your lesson. As we saw towards the end of last class's lesson, prior to entering into World War II, FDR was already kind of getting the American public and getting Congress kind of on board with the idea of being in this war in Europe. He knew it was really only a matter of time before this would happen, and a year before the United States gets involved, he is addressing Congress in his annual State of the Union address, and in it illustrates the four main reasons why America needs to be involved in the war. He feels that we need to help keep the country and keep the world safe by promoting four major freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And these four essential human freedoms are going to be what he based his arguments for when we do enter into World War II and why it is necessary for us to enter into the war. 2 years later, a man by the name of Norman Rockwell is going to illustrate these images for the public. And at this point, we are now going to be able to see these very abstract ideas in really identifiable and very recognizable ways. For example, the freedom of speech illustration shows a man, a very average man, no one really special, that is able to speak out at his local community town hall, and everyone is listening to him, even though he is clearly not the wealthiest man in the room. You see the freedom from fear, a parent tucking in their children and the father holding a newspaper that has a headline that illustrates the horrors that are going on in Europe due to the German attacks. The image of freedom from want will illustrate the ideas of having a close family, a happy family, but also enough food to feed your family. And we actually see this image in advertisements all the time at Thanksgiving and at Christmas. And then finally, freedom of worship. And you see people of all different faiths here being able to worship freely without consequence. These were the ideals that FDR was trying to get across, and they were so wonderfully illustrated by Norman Rockwell in these covers for the Saturday Evening Post. And then they would later on be sold to Americans to be able to, put up in their own homes, which was incredibly popular, and then the proceeds from them were used for the war effort. So as we go into the actual battles of the war, we're going to look at the two different places that we fight, because we're going to be actually having to split our military between the Pacific theater and the European theater. So since the Pacific is where we are first attacked, that's where I'm going to start our conversation about the battle history of World War II. December 7th, 1941, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, but that's not the only place that we were attacked. Japan also attacked the American holdings in Guam and the Philippines. Guam falls after only a few hours, and it's mainly because there weren't a lot of people there already. We didn't have a strong military presence because we never really expected to get attacked there. So unfortunately, the island fell incredibly quickly. The Philippines, however, it was much more well prepared and more defended. However, it's still not as well defended or prepared as Hawaii had been. And so the U.S. and the Filipino forces that were trying to push the Japanese out ended up getting pushed back onto the Batam Peninsula. And this small little area is going to be their prison, that they are going to get trapped there, and there's not going to be anywhere for them to go. And so it's just going to be this siege by the Japanese. And after 3 long, bloody, treacherous years of fighting, they finally had to surrender. They had no food left. They had no medical supplies. They were out of virtually all of their weaponry. They were actually filling cannons with shrapnel and with pieces of wood and bark because they had run out of actual ammunition. And with this surrender would become the beginning of the Bataan Death March. This was an absolutely horrific event. After the American and Filipino, as well as British and Australians, had surrendered, they would then be taken control of by the Japanese. Now, the Japanese at this time were following an ancient code known as the Bushido Code, and this was an extreme code of honor. It's what you would see like if you're talking about samurai, where honor is everything, and if they fail, that it was better for them to fall on their own sword than for them to be taken in battle. And that's really the code that the Japanese are following at this time. So when the Americans and when the Filipinos surrender, the Japanese basically see them as lower than dirt, that you are not even human. You have given up all of your rights to humanity by surrendering. And so this is going to be their justification for some of the absolutely inhumane and cruel acts that they will have against the Americans and the other allies that they captured. On this forced march from the Bataan Peninsula to their prison camp, which would be Camp O'Donnell, hundreds would die along the way due to starvation, disease, physical abuse, or sometimes just execution as a way to prove a point and prove the power of the Japanese over these POWs. And when they got to Camp O'Donnell, the conditions were no better, that they would be starved, they would be treated inhumanely, they would have no medical attention, and many, many, many thousands more of them would die even after they got to the camp. One of these POWs, Lieutenant John Spainhour, was quoted as saying, "I was questioned by a Japanese officer who found out that I had been in a Philippine scout battalion. The Japanese hated the scouts. Anyway, they took me outside and I was forced to watch as they buried 6 of my scouts alive. They made the men dig their own graves and then had them kneel down in a pit. The guards hit them over the head with shovels to stun them and piled earth on top." This was not uncommon, and in many cases, you would be called out to roll call, and the last person to come out to roll call, they would kill the man to the right and to the left of you, but they would leave you alive so that you would now have to live with the guilt of causing the deaths of 2 other men. This was the physical and psychological abuse that was done by the Japanese that they felt was justified by the fact that these POWs had surrendered. Most Americans would not actually know the devastation of the events in Bataan for many years until towards the end of the war, and some not even till after the war. And the images of the men you see here, they aren't Holocaust victims. These are men that actually survived the treatment in Camp O'Donnell in Bataan. And the man you see on the right-hand side is actually a Australian soldier who was beheaded because he was the leader of one of these groups, and the Japanese wanted to make an example of him and to take away the leadership and thus the hope of the men who were left behind. The man that would lead us in the Pacific Theater was going to be General Douglas MacArthur, and if the name sounds familiar, yes, it's the same General Douglas MacArthur that used the flamethrowers against the Bonus Army just a few years prior. So, as you probably have already guessed, this man does not do anything halfway. But although he did some pretty rough things before, he's actually the best person that we probably could have had in the Pacific, just because he was about as stubborn as the Japanese were, and he was not going to give up, and he was not going to quit, and he would not ask his men to do anything that he himself was not willing to do. So he was actually a wonderful person for us to have there in our leadership. Now, the first major battle in the Pacific Theater that we are going to look at is the Doolittle Raid. This was America's first offensive strike against Japan. And this actually was designed to be a surprise attack. We did get found out, and it nearly was a scrapped attack. They were going to just let it go. But they had spent so much time planning it that they finally were like, okay, well, we just got to go with it. And so We launched our planes from a aircraft carrier not too far off the coast of Japan. We flew over Tokyo, bombed Tokyo, and then landed in China. Well, a few of them landed in China. Most of them, their planes started to run out of gas, and they actually had to eject themselves out of their planes in order to save themselves. And not all of the pilots made it. But this was still seen as incredible success because Japan did not expect it. Japan thought that after Pearl Harbor, our abilities in the Pacific had been basically destroyed. So they definitely were not expecting us to be able to respond so quickly. But also beyond that, we attacked Tokyo. We came incredibly close to killing their emperor. And if we had done that successfully, that really would have killed the morale of the men fighting for their country. The next one is the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway is going to be the turning point in the war in the Pacific. Japan was planning a surprise attack at Midway Island, and Midway Island gets its name because it's midway between the United States and Japan across the Pacific Ocean. And this island was an essential stopping off point with our supply lines to Australia. So if the Japanese had been successful, we would have been in a lot of trouble and we would have had an incredibly difficult time fighting them. Thankfully, we were able to discover the plan through our code breakers, and we actually launched a surprise attack on their surprise attack. And we were able to actually catch them off guard to the point that we destroyed a significant portion of the Japanese Navy. I believe it was 4 aircraft carriers and 38 planes were destroyed. So it's a significant portion of their overall Navy, and that was a huge benefit for us because that meant we would now be able to focus mainly on fighting on land, which is where we definitely had the advantage. But despite the fact that we had the advantage on land, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to have an easy time fighting them on land. Because remember, they follow the Bushido Code. They follow this code of absolute honor. And so they will fight down to the last man. They will fight when other countries would have already surrendered. So we basically know that this is a suicide mission if we decide to attack Japan directly. So we go with a plan that is developed under MacArthur known as island hopping. So this is an image of the island hopping campaign, and it looks really confusing. So I want to just kind of have us look at a couple of things. The whole thing's going to start off here in Hawaii because that's where Pearl Harbor is going to get us into this war. And we've already talked about the battle at Midway Island as well. And at that point, we are going to realize that we need to get ourselves closer to Japan. Now, as I said, attacking Japan directly is basically a suicide mission. So what we do, if you notice, is that we are going to be hopping from island to island, getting ourselves closer and closer to Japan. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to fight in a place, to then conquer it, bring our supplies a little bit closer, and then rebuild and kind of get ourselves ready for the next attack. Then we go to the next location, we attack, we conquer, we bring our supplies, we rebuild. And we do this getting closer and closer and closer to Japan. Yes, this is going to take so much longer than what would normally take for a direct attack. But again, as we've said, if we tried to attack them completely directly, we would not have been successful because the Japanese had too strong of a military, they still had too many supplies, and they had too much motivation to fight. So this would be a way to slowly wear them down. This is kind of like a very long game version of a war of attrition, except we felt that this was going to be the best method to fight them simply because of their attachment to the Bushido Code. So again, the purpose is to prevent a destructive all-out war with Japan, and we get closer and closer and closer by taking over the less fortified islands along the way. The other reason why this is going to be incredibly helpful for us is because throughout that area, there are a lot of coral reefs. And these coral reefs make it extremely difficult to maneuver our large ships. So if we are able to go kind of shorter distances, we don't have to use our big giant ships. We can use smaller watercraft that make the movement of supplies much easier. So now we're going to switch gears and we are going to look at the European theater, and we're actually going to spend more of our efforts as a nation trying to defeat Hitler, partially because we know that the Japanese are just not going to be easy to defeat and they're not going to give up. So we know that that's going to be a long, arduous thing. But with Hitler, we also know that he's really the more dangerous one, and so we want to deal with him first. Surprisingly, the European theater is actually going to start in Africa. The Axis powers had slowly been taking over territory in Africa during the previous 5 to 10 years. And one of the areas that they are going to be looking to gain control is an area right here known as the Suez Canal. And the reason why that is so incredibly important is because it is the only waterway connection between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea that then links over to the Indian Ocean. Basically, without this very small waterway right here, you would have to go all the way around Africa to be able to get to Asia. And considering that we're fighting a war on two sides of the world, this tiny little place right here is essential for us and our supply lines. So we definitely want to make sure that we don't allow the Axis to gain control of the Suez Canal. But it wasn't going to be easy for us. One of the reasons is because they had one of their best generals down in Africa, and that is going to be this guy, General Erwin Rommel, who gets the nickname of the Desert Fox. And he gets this nickname because of his amazing ability to use sly tactics and ambushes and things like that to attack the Allies. FDR is going to actually decide that this is the place where our men need to get their feet wet when it comes to the European theater. This is where we're going to get used to fighting. And he figured that overall it was generally going to be a pretty easy fight, that it wasn't going to be all that difficult because, it's a smaller force that's over there than what they had in the rest of Europe. And so this would just be a good chance for our men to get some experience. Our men would be led by two really incredible leaders. One is going to be General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who we'll talk more about later, and this guy, General George Patton. Patton was an incredibly stoic figure. He was extremely demanding of his men, but similar to MacArthur, he wouldn't ask his men to do anything that he would not do himself. And really, this was really good for them because he definitely whipped them into shape and got them to realize that this was serious and that this was not let's go play war, that this was a life or death situation. And in this, because of the abilities of the Desert Fox, as well as the difficulty of fighting in very unknown and unfamiliar territory, there were some serious casualties before we were able to push the Axis back out of Africa. Now, just a quick hop, skip, and a jump across the Mediterranean Sea from northern Africa is Sicily. And for those of you guys who don't know, Sicily is the little island that looks like it's getting kicked by the boot of Italy. This was going to be our next attempted takeover because it would help disrupt the Axis supply chain. When we were able to take this over, we were then able to start to conquer Italy. Mussolini was arrested, and this was good for us, but very quickly thereafterwards, as you might expect, Hitler's going to come sweeping in to try and save his BFF. And we didn't really have too much of a choice here as to how we would attack. So please ignore my horrible drawing of Italy right here, but basically, this is Italy right here. And where the Germans are going to coming in through, so they're going to come in through this way, and we're going to kind of be stuck. So what we decide to do is that we actually send our men in behind, and we're going to attack from behind the Axis lines. And our goal is to try and trap the German army here on the peninsula that is Italy. But the problem is that we also have to remember that up here behind us is the rest of the German army. So we are stuck behind Axis lines, and there are incredibly high casualties. Over 300,000 men would be lost in a 5-month-long battle here. A few weeks later, the Allies were able to liberate Rome, and the people of Italy were thrilled. Because you have to remember, this was a fascist regime. And under fascism, all of the money in the country goes to the military. So while Italy had an incredibly powerful and well-equipped military, the average person living in Italy was starving, and they had no medical equipment. And these people had been ignored by their government and were absolutely bitter towards the leadership, which is going to also be a problem for us because we wanted to be able to capture Mussolini again and put him on trial and be able to get some information out of him. However, the Italians got to him first, and they put him on trial, quote unquote, and it was very, very quickly established that he was guilty, and he was sentenced to execution. Now, interestingly enough, moments before he is to be executed by firing squad, his longtime mistress jumps in front of the bullets to save him and is then shot and killed herself, to which the guys just reload and shoot him anyway. So now you have Mussolini and his mistress strung up by their toes in the middle of Milan, and the people are throwing things at it. They're throwing rocks, they're throwing mud, they're throwing rotten food and animal poop and anything that they can find to throw at these two bodies. And by the time that they were taken down just a few hours later, you could hardly recognize what was left of them. This now brings us to the turning point in the war in Europe, and that is going to be the D-Day invasion. The official name for D-Day is actually Operation Overlord, and this was the invasion of Normandy, France. This would be led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would be leading the entire Allied forces. In preparation for this, they wanted to make sure that they maintained the element of surprise, because it was clear to the Germans and pretty much everybody else that we were going to be attempting to take back control of France. That was going to be our next goal. So the Germans were already expecting an attack. They just didn't really know where. And we would use that to our advantage, which we'll talk about later. The other thing that we could use to our advantage was the day and the time that we would attack. And that's actually where D-Day gets its name. Because of the very specific conditions that we would need in creating this attack at the perfect conditions, we kept having to change the date of the attack. And so what they end up doing is they just write in the letter D as in like the future date to which we will attack. So for anyone who has ever told you that D-Day stands for Destruction Day or Devastation Day or something like that, the D in D-Day literally just stands for a date, a future date to be determined. But we knew that we were going to be attacking at several beaches along the coast of Normandy, and these were going to be Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Juno. And the deadliest of these beaches would be Omaha Beach, which we'll look at in just a moment. The attack on Normandy would be an immense event. This was going to have over 1 million men prepared to fight. We didn't send 1 million men, but the fact that we got a million men ready and prepared, that shows you how big of an effort this was going to be. This was requiring thousands and thousands of pieces of ammunition and landing craft and aircraft, And so this was a huge endeavor. Now, the plan for D-Day was that we were going to have paratroopers land behind enemy lines and basically cut off the supply lines, as well as start firing upon the Germans from behind so that they would turn their backs on the beach. Then we would be able to land on the beaches and fight our way up and then defeat the Germans from the other direction. That is the plan. To do this, though, we're going to need to have a night that has some moonlight so that our paratroopers can see where they're landing and they can see where they're going, but not so much moonlight that the Germans would spot our planes and be able to shoot down our men. We also needed a night that had relatively calm seas because we were going to be sending our men mainly on these landing craft that were going to go across the English Channel. So again, needed to make sure that we were getting there at a certain hour with a certain tide, and that's part of the reason why the timing of this kept changing over and over. But when we landed it at Omaha Beach specifically, and the landing craft was prevented from getting closer due to anti-landing craft gear that had been put into the water, these big metal things that are known as hedgehogs. Because these were put into the water, they couldn't get close enough. So our men had to get out into the water and then make their way up the beach. And it basically made them sitting ducks. And because of this, over 2,500 men were lost on this beach alone. So we're going to pause here for a couple of moments, and you guys are actually going to be watching the first few scenes from the movie Saving Private Ryan that illustrates the D-Day scene, and specifically the scene on Omaha Beach. When this was created by Steven Spielberg, he really wanted to make it as lifelike and realistic as possible. And men that were there that day have stated that it is the most accurate portrayal of the D-Day invasion that they have ever seen. Because it is an accurate portrayal of D-Day, it is extremely violent and it is extremely brutal and can be incredibly disturbing, some of the things that are going to be seen. So I want to forewarn you about that, because if you feel uncomfortable seeing the gruesome side of war, and the things you will see are quite gruesome, as well as being surrounded and bombarded with the loud noises that come along with it, you are free to go and visit another class for the time that we're going to be watching this, and then we'll come get you after this film clip is over. However, for those of you guys who are going to be watching it, I would like you to consider, as you watch it, what made this particular beach so deadly and what made this overall attack so important to our efforts in liberating France. Starting just a few years ago, people go out on the anniversary of D-Day every June to mark the places where people had fallen. And what they do is they draw this little silhouetted outline of representing the body of every single person that died on Omaha Beach. And when you see it finished, it's absolutely amazing and horrifying to see these outlines of what represents the men that died on this one single beach in this one single battle to be able to take back France. After taking the coastline, we would then be relying extremely heavily upon the French resistance. When France was taken over by Germany, they only took over the northern half. The southern half had been able to remain relatively free, and people that lived in the northern as well as the southern half were trying to resist against this German government and wanting to make France free again. These people waged pretty bloody guerrilla warfare against Germans in their area, and they were incredibly important to spreading information to the Allies, to getting supplies where they needed to be, as well as helping people escape from German occupation. The girl that you see to the right-hand side was one of the most well-known fighters within the French resistance. Her name was Simone Seguin, and she was an 18-year-old French resistance fighter. She had 2 confirmed kills in the fighting in Paris, as well as assisted in the capture of 25 German POWs in another city in France. So it's really remarkable to understand that not only were these untrained people, they were not actual soldiers, but that they were doing a lot of their fighting, by their own homes and for their own country, using weapons that they had stolen from the enemy. And it's amazing to know that one of their greatest fighters was a girl not much older than you guys are. So with the success at Normandy and the assistance of the French resistance, we were able to help liberate Paris just 2 months after landing at Normandy on August 25th, 1944. And so here you see the Allied army being able to march so symbolically through the Arc de Triomphe, meaning the Arch of Triumph, that had been built for Napoleon a century earlier. So now we're going to be looking at what the life of a soldier would have been like during this war, and the various groups that are going to be contributing to the war effort as well. So you guys are going to get one more little video right here, and this is going to be the Private Snafu video. Now, before you watch it, let me quickly explain. Private Snafu was a cartoon character that was designed for the Army specifically to help train its men. Part of our problem was that there were a lot of young men entering into the military that had very low reading skills. So when we give them a giant manual about protocol and how to behave, they weren't going to be able to read it, and so they weren't going to be prepared for battle or for Army life. And so they created Private Snafu as some entertaining cartoons that would be an easy way to get these young men to understand what to do and what not to do. Private Snafu gets its name from an unofficial military acronym that stands for Situation Normal, All Effed Up. And it's basically saying that it's normal in the military for things to be completely messed up. And Private Snafu does everything wrong. And he was the best non-example for men of how not to behave and the things not to do. It's going to be very recognizable to you guys for a few reasons. One, the director of this is Frank Capra, the man who directed It's a Wonderful Life. The script would be written by Dr. Seuss, and you'll totally recognize it just by the rhyming method within the video. And then finally, it would be voiced by Mel Blanc, who you will recognize as the voice of Bugs Bunny. So the one that you guys are going to be watching is titled Spies. And I want you to keep in mind and consider what is it that they are trying to teach young men about spies in the military within this film clip. So as you probably gathered from the Private Snafu videos is that there's a lot that these young men had to learn. And we had to get them military ready going into this war. Now, as opposed to World War I, when we went to war and then called for a draft, in World War II, we actually called for a draft before we got involved in the war, a whole year before we got involved in the war. Why would we call for a draft of men if we weren't getting into a war? That seems a little odd. And the reason that FDR ordered for this is because he was afraid that we would be attacked at some point and wanted to make sure that we had a military already in place and that was already trained, just in case the worst happened. All men between the ages of 18 and 45 were required to go and report for military service. However, not all of them would obviously be selected. And they were only going to be brought in for a one-year term. So most of these men were brought in October of 1940. And when October of 1941 came around and they were not released from duty, a lot of them started to get very angry and started to write Ohio all over their helmets and their gear. Ohio standing for over the hill in October, trying to, protest the fact that they had not been let go when they were promised. However, just about a month and a half later, we would be attacked at Pearl Harbor, and a lot of them would actually voluntarily re-enlist to make sure that they could help out with the war effort. So what we're going to look at from this point onward is the specific military groups, the specialty military groups, and how they are going to contribute to the war effort. The first of these is probably the most amazing hoax in military history. This is totally the modern Trojan horse, and it's all going to start off with a Spanish aristocrat by the name of Juan Pujol Garcia. Spain was not involved in World War II, and yet this man wanted to be involved and wanted to help the Allies. When he went to Britain and asked them if he could work as a spy for them, they basically said that your country's not involved, so thanks but no thanks. So he really wanted to be a spy. So he goes to the Germans and says, hey, I want to be a spy for you. And they say, well, what are you going to do for us? And he starts rattling off all these names of all these people that he's associated with and all the information he can get from them. And they say, well, okay, you get us the information and we'll believe you, and then we'll make you a spy. Well, the names were all completely and utterly bogus names. But now that he had this opportunity, he goes back to the British and he says, hey, just went and talked to the Germans and they're willing to make me a spy for them. How about you make me a spy for you and I'll be a double agent? And so the Brits hire him straight away and they start feeding him all of this information to feed to the Germans, all of this false information and false intelligence. And he is going to be a huge part in helping us redirect the Germans' attention away from Normandy so that we can attack there. So we know that we're going to try and attack at Normandy, but we're trying to keep it under wraps that is where we're planning on attacking. And so Juan Pujol Garcia is actually going to be feeding information to the Germans that we are thinking of attacking not at France, but that we're actually going to be attacking up in the Netherlands, and that we're going to attack up there and try and sweep down through Belgium. And so Germany believes this because this guy's given them enough, somewhat legit information that they believe what he's saying. And so they send a large portion of their army up to the Netherlands to try and stop us from attacking there, and leaving a much smaller army down in France, which was definitely to our benefit. Now, coming alongside this and working in conjunction, though totally separate, was going to be the Ghost Army. And this was another brilliant way that we used Americans' talents to our advantage in war. Now, the Ghost Army gets its name for two reasons. Number one, because it was a secret division that very few people actually knew about. But the other reason is that they're a ghost army in the sense that they're not really there. See, what this was is that this was a group of artists and stage directors from theater and sound technicians and actors and all kinds of people involved in theater and the movies and the arts. And what these people were instructed to do was to create very realistic looking military sites to fake out the Germans. And they were brilliant at it. As you can see here, they have these giant inflatable tanks that they made. And although, as you're looking at it in this picture, obviously it's fake because they're lifting it up like it's, a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloon. But if you are seeing this on the ground, and a whole bunch of them out in a field, and you're looking at this through binoculars from a German spy plane, or you're looking at this from far away using, other forms of espionage, you would think that they're real. And when that is paired with sound being blasted out through hidden speakers that sounds like people working on machinery or people talking, in a camp or generals barking orders, that all sounds totally realistic. And so this was helping to distract the Germans from places that we actually were at. And these men were incredibly important throughout the entire European theater, but especially in helping us fake out the Germans and thinking where we were going to attack in France. Our friend Juan Pujol Garcia had helped them get most of their people out of France, but they still had a lot of people in France. And so we wanted to misdirect them in where we were particularly going to land. So the Ghost Army set up a camp, a totally fake camp with these sound bites that made it sound like we were planning to attack at a place a little bit north of there, which was known as Pas de Calais. And so they actually sent quite a lot of their army focusing on Calais rather than focusing on Normandy. And again, making this easier for us to then take control of. The Ghost Army was completely classified for many, many, many years afterwards. In fact, it was so classified that when the men came home from war, they basically weren't able to not only talk about what they did, but they actually had a made-up fake group that they were quote-unquote part of in the war. The next group is actually not a fighting group. It's actually going to be a group of, again, artists and architects and museum curators and scholars who are known as the Monuments Men. And you might recognize the name because they actually had a movie made about this just a couple of years ago. These men were given the job of trying to protect as well as find a lot of art that was being attacked and stolen by the Nazis. The Nazis were not only attacking places that had priceless works of art, but were stealing thousands upon thousands upon thousands of works of art and were destroying many, many, many others. And so they were trying to preserve a lot of this cultural history. And it was so important that they did. The Monuments Men were able to track down and find huge stores of gold and huge stores of paintings and sculptures that the Nazis had been hoarding. The reasons that the Nazis had been doing this is because Hitler actually wanted to build a museum that would be an honor to himself and his glory. It would be the biggest and most elaborate museum in the entire world, known as the Führer Museum. And so he was stealing all these works of art to then put into that museum. And the ones that they found are some of these priceless works of art. Like they found the Mona Lisa, and they found works by Raphael and by Michelangelo, and they were able to preserve these. One of these pieces of art that was nearly destroyed was a fresco that you will probably all recognize, and that is the fresco of The Last Supper done by Leonardo da Vinci. Many of these pieces of art were found in salt mines and copper mines and basically hidden way down deep inside the earth. And it is absolutely incredible that we were able to find them through various bits of intelligence and some pretty good detective work on the part of the Monuments Men. This is just one room in an abandoned castle that the Nazis had been storing a lot of artwork and stuff into. But it wasn't just artwork. It was also Jewish Torahs and prayer shawls and things that they had stolen from people's homes. It has been a huge effort by the Monuments Men at the time, as well as efforts since then by the U.S. government and the governments of the Allies to restore these works of art to the people that they belong to. Unfortunately, a lot of these works of art are unable to be returned because either we can't identify who they were originally from, or the people have been killed in the Holocaust and there was no one to bring them back to. But their work was so incredibly important because although you may not think that art is so important in the grand scheme of fighting a war, you have to understand that these were priceless cultural works of art. These were things that were our history. And if we allowed the Nazis to steal them and destroy them, we would be losing that history and losing the identification of those things that had been so important to us in the past. And so it is really, truly important for us as historians to understand really the importance of what they did. The next group we have are the Navajo Code Talkers. The Navajo Code Talkers were located within the Pacific, and they were brought in because of a problem that we were having with sending messages. The Germans had a code-making/breaking machine known as the Enigma machine that was seemingly impossible to break. And then we broke it. And when that was broken, it was made extremely clear that no code was unbreakable, and that any written code, any kind of transmitted code by word, could eventually be broken. And so we needed to find a way to transmit messages in the Pacific from island to island that couldn't be broken by the Japanese and couldn't be broken by the Germans. And that's where the Navajo came in, because these men spoke a language that was what we call a hidden language. And it's called that because there is no written version of Navajo. The only way to learn it is if you live with the Navajo. And there's nobody from Japan that lives with the Navajo, and there's no Germans that live with the Navajo. So it was guaranteed that no one on the enemy's side would understand this. But just in case they found a way to actually learn pieces of Navajo, they wouldn't understand how the Navajo were using their language to institute a code. They would break down English words into letters and spell out those letters using a series of completely unrelated words in Navajo. So they would for example, use the Navajo word for ant to represent the letter A, or the Navajo word for apple to represent A. And they would switch it up from time to time as a way to ensure that the enemy would not be able to pick up on what letters were and what those certain things might represent. And they were absolutely invaluable in our success in the Pacific. But like the work of the Ghost Army, their work was completely classified until the 1970s. So most Americans didn't even know that these men even existed, and the incredible importance of their work in our success in the Pacific theater. So here we have some examples of how they would spell out a message. They would, as I said, use different words for different letters or for the same letter to make sure that the code was not easily identifiable. They could also spell out the word, like with Navy, they would use needle, ant, Victor, and yucca. But they also had shorthand codes for words that they used a lot. So, for example, they used the Navajo word for iron fish to represent submarine, or hummingbird for fighter plane, or black street, meaning a squad, because the street would look black. They would use the word potato, as you might guess, to represent a grenade, because they're about the same size and the same shape. And so these were the ways that they were participating in the war, and yet most Americans didn't even know that they existed. Next, we have the Tuskegee Airmen, and this is an all-black Air Force unit that fought in World War II. They trained at the Tuskegee Institute, the same Tuskegee Institute that was started by Booker T. Washington about a half century earlier. And these men, unfortunately, were not utilized the way that they really should have been. Although they were incredible pilots, they were not used in actual fighting because, for the most part, we didn't think that they actually could do it. We didn't think that they were well trained enough. We didn't think that they were brave enough. We didn't think that they were smart enough. And we left all the real fighting to the white pilots. What they were doing is they were working as couriers. They were serving as trainers for the white pilots and training them and playing war games. And they would also help ferry planes and things like this. However, they did oftentimes serve as bodyguards for the white squadrons, drawing on enemy fire so that the white squadrons could get to where they really needed to be, which means that they would be shot at by the enemy and they would have to fight their way out of it. And the amazing thing is that they did this incredibly well. They had one of the lowest casualty rates of any Air Force group ever. And it's because of their incredible training and their incredible abilities. Now, within the wartime era, Eleanor Roosevelt was going out and basically serving as the face of the White House because due to polio, her husband wasn't really able to do so. He was in a wheelchair, as well as the fact that he's, a little busy running a war. So she would go out and she would be the face of the White House, and people absolutely adored Eleanor Roosevelt. She was kind and she was caring and she would listen to people, and she was truly interested in the things that they had to say. So she went down to go visit the airmen at the Tuskegee Institute, and she watched them do some of their training, and she saw them, flying around in their planes, and she eventually asked, will one of you take me up in the plane? That looks like such fun. You have to understand, this is the 1940s. The First Lady of the United States is going to go up in an airplane with a black pilot. The Secret Service was losing their minds, not only because, oh my God, the First Lady's going up in an airplane and we don't have a way to protect her, but also the fact that she was going up in a plane with a black pilot. They didn't trust him to keep her safe. But she's the First Lady and she gets to do what she wants to do, and so she went up in the plane, and as you can see when they landed, she was all smiles and so excited about her experience. And of course, you have to remember that wherever the First Lady goes, the press goes. And so the press snapped this photograph and it went into the newspapers and the magazines, and she was just glowing over how she felt about, the Tuskegee Airmen, about what wonderful pilots they were and how well trained and how patriotic and so on and so forth, and was just absolutely singing their praises. And this makes the president kind of look bad because he was not only keeping the military segregated, but also was kind of giving them jobs that were not real fighting jobs, and was discriminating against them. And then she goes one step further and kind of sticks it to her husband by inviting them to the White House for dinner. And as you might guess, this did not go over very well with the president. But since she had done it publicly, he didn't really have a choice. And so they were invited to the White House, and she was a huge fighter for equality, and she would do a lot to help create greater equality in the United States throughout the rest of her life. Next, we have the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was a specific battalion that was only made up of Japanese American fighters. And they are also known as the Purple Heart Battalion because they have the largest percentage of men that have earned the Purple Heart. And you get the Purple Heart Award, the medal, if you have been injured in battle. Now, these men were incredibly brave, but what's really even more remarkable about their bravery is the fact that the Japanese in America were severely mistreated at this time. They were interned, and many of these men, their family members, were in internment camps, and they're fighting for the country that is imprisoning their family members. So that shows just what incredible loyalty they have to the United States, and some of them fought specifically for that reason, to show their loyalty. Now, why these men gained so much notoriety is because of their association with the Lost Battalion. Unfortunately, a battalion had gotten themselves completely surrounded by the Germans, and a couple of other groups had been sent in to try and save them, and to no avail, and with high casualty. So somebody needed to go in and get them, but it was a suicide mission. The 442nd volunteered to go in, and they not only were able to fight their way through the German lines in to be able to get the battalion, the Lost Battalion, but they fought their way out, and not a single member of the Lost Battalion was killed in this. Several members of the 442nd were injured and killed protecting the Lost Battalion. And again, I feel like this just shows their loyalty that much more, that they would go in for a suicide mission to rescue people for a country that treats them like second-class citizens. It truly is a remarkable, brave, and selfless act that they committed. And last but not least, we get to women in the military. This is actually going to be the first time that women are officially members of the military. So they are no longer just helping out as nurses or, following along behind the camps. They are soldiers just like their male counterparts. And the reason for women entering into the military was to release a man for combat. Now, what this particular phrase meant was that men were needed on the front lines to actually fight against the Germans, to actually fight against the Japanese. We didn't need them in an office somewhere doing inventory. We didn't need them drawing out maps. We didn't need them doing any of that kind of work. Women could do that work. They could do those desk jobs, and that would put men in availability for actual combat. The very first of these military positions for women is going to be the Women's Army Corps. The Women's Army Corps are going to be known as WWIIs, and the WWIIs are the first, as I said, official military unit for women. Most of them are going to be doing these kind of clerical non-combat support jobs, and most of them are going to be stateside, but there are going to be some that are sent overseas to go and assist over there. Now, up at the top right-hand corner here, you will see their symbol, which was the symbol of Athena, who is the goddess of war. So she was kind of their mascot for the WWIIs. The Navy also had their own version of a women's military, and they were known as WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. These WAVES, however, only served stateside, and the reason being is because they didn't trust young male sailors to be on ships with these young female sailors, as you can kind of see here. So because of this, they were kept stateside and were only allowed to assist in these clerical non-combat jobs here at home. And of course, we're going to have one of these organizations for the Air Force, and that is going to be the WASPs, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. The WASPs are going to be very similar to the Tuskegee Airmen in a lot of ways, in that they are not going to be allowed to be in any kind of direct combat. They were generally there as assistants and as couriers, and they ferried planes from one place to the other. They were occasionally shot at by the enemy, and they did fight, and there were a few casualties, but for the most part, they were really not allowed to be in any real danger, that they were just serving as assistants or as support staff. But the WASPs were very good at what they did. Most of the time what they were doing, if they weren't actually in the process of ferrying planes or moving cargo, is that they were helping the men stay on point with their training. So they would actually train the men by having kind of, war games and simulated dog fights to keep the men that were going to be fighting on the front lines trained. So these ladies were actually incredibly good at what they did. And their mascot, seen here, is going to be called Fifinella. Fifinella was a character that was originally created by Roald Dahl, who is the author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda and the BFG and the Witches and all those other great books. And it was drawn by Walt Disney. And this would be their symbol and their mascot, as you can see on the jackets of the women here in the photograph. So that's the end of our lesson for today. I'm sorry that, for those of you guys who were really hoping we were going to get more into the military strategy, unfortunately, that's not going to be on the AP exam. So you might want to look into taking some college classes that specifically look at military strategy if that's your area of interest. But I do want to point out that on the AP exam, when it comes to the actual battles here, really what you're looking at is going to be the motivations, the turning points, as well as the strategies, the overall strategies that go into our decisions of where to fight, and how we are going to succeed in defeating the enemy. So we've gotten up to the turning points in these, and in a couple of classes, we will then look at how we wrap up the Second World War and wrap up these two different theaters.